Okay, good morning, everyone. I want to apologize for beginning the lesson a bit late. The roads here in Japan were very crowded, and I got stuck in quite a bit of traffic. It's not an excuse, but it actually leads into what I want to talk about today. So that's why I brought it up. So a lot of people, both those of you who live here in Japan in my class, as well as those of you in Yonsei University and Fudan University, probably have the image that Japan is a country that is very much overpopulated with a very high population density. And this is not untrue, particularly for the Tokyo metropolitan area. However, there is a very real question today about whether or not Japan is going to continue to be a heavily populated country and what Japan's population will look like going forward. Hence, please come in. Hence, while I may have trouble getting to school today with the number of people on the road, that may not be the case in a few years. So, today's lecture is titled Aging Asia, How Demographic Change Will Reshape Northeast Asia. So, I want to begin by just showing you a quick outline of the lecture here, and then I'm going to talk about all of this. I'll just skip this. But the first thing I need to discuss, I think, this morning is what is demography? Because I imagine that there may be a few people in this class who have never come across this term or don't have a strong grasp of what it is. So demography is, put very simply, the study of populations via records and statistics. Well, primarily records and statistics. There are other ways to go about demographic analysis, but those are some of the most important. So particularly when looking at demography, some of the most important statistics that we look at are births, deaths, and fertility. Although there are others, including ethnicity, income groups, and a wide variety of other characteristics. So you may have heard of, well, I guess I want to say that demography is basically the study of populations. And by populations, we mean groups of people. Now, you may have heard of something called the demographic transition. It's talked about quite a lot, both in academia, in the news media, and just in the social sciences in general, because it's a concept that's been very influential. I don't have time to go into the full history of the demographic transition today, but I will be showing you a brief outline of it on the next slide. Before I do that, I do want to explain one quick demographic concept that's going to be very important for understanding today's material, which is that in demography we have a measure of fertility which is called TFR, or total fertility rate. And that averages out the number of children an average woman will have during her lifetime in a given population. Now, for a population to replace itself, the TFR, or the fertility rate, needs to be roughly 2.1 children per woman. And that's because some children obviously don't live to or all the way through adulthood and have children themselves. Now, of course, the reason we're talking about aging in Asia and really around the world, of course, is that fertility in many parts of the world, particularly here in Asia, has fallen well below this 2.1 replacement rate figure. So 2.1 is what's called generally replacement rate fertility, the rate at which a population needs to reproduce to sustain its existing numbers. So this is a very nice graph of the demographic transition, or at least the theory of the demographic transition, because I should mention that it is a theory that's made by a group called Our World in Data. I think it's, so you have stage one of the demographic transition, and in stage one, both birth rates and death rates are very high. because there's no contraception, people generally have large families, 4, 5, 6 children plus. And because there is, generally speaking, no modern medicine, people also die, particularly children die, at very, very high rates, which is also part of why people have so many children, because the children, many of them are not likely to make it to adulthood. So in the first stage of the demographic transition, the degree of natural increase for the population is stable, low, or negative, which is to say that the population either stays at roughly the same size, or it grows very slowly, or it may actually, it's not written here, but it may actually even decrease in times of epidemic disease. Sorry, I was losing my voice a couple days ago, so I'm hoping I can make it through the lecture. Speaking of disease. So in the second stage of the demographic transition, as modernity, early stage modernity begins to have an impact, what you see is that birth rates generally remain very high, but death rates begin to fall rapidly as concepts such as, for some reason my brain's not working this morning, but cleanliness, and basically just the basic concepts of modern medicine and science, the understanding of disease. These things begin to slowly spread throughout the population, and as best practices proliferate, you see a very sharp decline in the death rate. And so what happens is, because the death rate falls very quickly, but the birth rate stays high for a relatively long period of time, you have a very rapid natural increase in the number of people within that given population. Now in stage 3, the birth rate begins to fall, whether because of contraception or also because of natural preferences, as people they don't need to have as many children anymore because the children that they do have are likely to survive to adulthood. So there's less reason to have 5 or 6 or 7 children. You can do with 1 or 2 or 3. And so this leads to the population growth slowing down. You no longer have a rapid increase, you have a much more kind of controlled and slow increase in population. And then you have stages 4 and 5 at the end of the graph. And so stage 4, the birth rate is low. The death rate, of course, is low. I guess I failed to mention that by stage 3, you have diminishing returns on the decrease in the death rate because, as modern medicine has progressed, while it is very, very impressive, the rate at which we have increased our knowledge, and I guess you could say been able to increase the human lifespan, the pace has slowed a bit. And so by stage 4, you have a low birth rate and a low death rate, which generally leads to a stable population with a slow increase. Now, the problem is that originally, the demographic transition is supposed to stop here at stage 4. And I think that the people who originally came up with this theory thought that populations would end up being stable, which is to say that they would end up with a very low death rate and replacement rate fertility as people sought to optimize their family choices. However, we've actually ended up with very low birth rates that are below replacement rate in a lot of societies. And this has led to the phenomenon that I want to talk about today, which is aging populations. So here, you have at best stable populations, but often you have a slow, or sometimes not so slow, decrease over time. And I would encourage any of you who have any questions about the demographic transition, please feel free to email me or just look up the concept on your own. There's a lot of information out there, and it's a really pretty pivotal concept in a lot of how we think about the world today. So I do want to take a quick moment to mention the politics of demography, because on the one hand, demography as a science that looks a lot at records and at numbers of people is often considered a very rational strain of the social sciences. And yet in a lot of ways, it's actually inherently, or at least since its inception in the 19th century, demography has always been, at least to some degree, a very much political science. And I say that because when demography first began to coalesce as a science, one of the first places that it really came to prominence was in France during the 19th century. Because during the 19th century in France, France is a very unique case in that France's population actually stabilized in the mid-1800s and stopped growing. I shouldn't say stopped growing, but grew much slower than the rest of Europe for the preceding about 100 years until about 1950, at which point it began to grow a little bit faster, which really is just to say that the rest of Europe started growing slower at a similar rate to France. But the initial concern was very much about underpopulation. We don't have enough people in comparison to, say, Germany, and that's going to put us at a disadvantage, so we need to get people to have more kids. That's obviously a very political stance. And then in the 20th century, particularly before, during, and after the Second World War, you began to have concerns about overpopulation. You had people saying, we don't have enough land to support our population. Sometimes that was used as an excuse during the 20th century to invade other people's lands because, well, we need living space. You've probably heard of that concept before. And so even after the Second World War, there was a very, very strong bias in demography on how do we overcome the challenge of overpopulation? How do we help people in developed countries have the number of children that they want to have that will be optimal for them and optimal for society and not overly burdensome? How do we help people in the developing world have less children so that they don't perpetuate the cycle of poverty? And this was such a strong focus of demography for so many years, for so many decades actually, that for a long time nobody even really thought about, well, what happens if we push have less kids, have less kids, have less kids so far that people are only having one child per couple and suddenly the population is shrinking? This is a problem. Why is it a problem? It's a problem because many of our social systems, at least in developed countries, are built on the assumption that population will always increase, or at the very least that it will always be stable, and that there will be a balance between the generations. But when there's not, pension systems in particular, oftentimes, well, I don't want to say stop working because none of them have actually stopped working yet, but their functioning has definitely begun to deteriorate, and the amount of the national budget in almost every country, every developed country, that the pension system takes up has been increasing for the last several decades. So now we've got a bit of a dichotomy. I put back again, which is to say that are we worried about underpopulation again? And I would say that's not quite true. We have a duality now where in the developing world there's still very much a concern about overpopulation. I went to a conference where I brought this issue up, and somebody was like, no. Like, you don't understand. There's so many people all over the world who are under 20. It's a huge problem. They don't have good jobs. They don't have good prospects. And it's a much bigger problem than aging. And while I disagree with that general stance, I think that it is equally important to continue to deal with issues of overpopulation, or at least a larger population than the economy can support in developing countries. But at the same time, we also have to be concerned about how do we maintain social stability and economic viability in developing countries, or in developed countries. And I think that the answer to that is that we have to achieve some form of demographic stability. Two other important concepts that I want to introduce from demography at the moment are the working age population, which could probably be adjusted, but generally the working age population has been accepted to be people between the ages of 15 and 64. Now, obviously, we don't generally put 15, 16, 17-year-olds to work today, at least in most developed countries. We encourage them to stay in school or to, well, generally to stay in school up to the end of high school. And we encourage many of them to go to college. So some people have suggested, at least for developed countries, raising that minimum on the working age to 22 or even 24, but that's a separate discussion. 64 has been considered, again, the kind of upper end of the productive age, although here too there is a lot of debate in recent years about whether or not this should be brought up to maybe 68 or 70, because people are working longer in developed countries, even when they don't have to. Just people are healthier than they used to be, and thus they can live productive lives much longer. But the working age population is generally considered to be the portion of the population that is actively contributing most heavily to the economy. You then have the two dependent populations. You have the child-dependent population, which is people under 14 who cannot take care of themselves, and then people who are over 65 who are also considered to be unable to generally take care of themselves. So this is childhood dependency and old age dependency. So generally speaking, what most countries, particularly during their high growth periods, want to do is they want to lower what's called their dependency rate, which means they want to increase the number of people in this working age bracket while decreasing the number of people in the dependent bracket. Because when you do that, you can focus society's resources in the area of what you might call the largest returns. However, there's consequences for this, because if you're increasing your working age population by decreasing your dependency ratio, that generally means that you're encouraging people, again, to have smaller families, which is fine, but eventually people are going to grow old. And when they grow old, they're going to need pensions, health care, and other resources that society will have to provide. And so societies end up having a choice, which is that they can either grow old, accept migrants, or have children. And as I said, a lot of earlier demographic theories didn't really grapple with the question of what happens after we kind of conquer the specter of overpopulation. What happens once we've taught people how to manage their families? Where do we go from there? And so predictions that societies would stabilize have proven to be, at least initially, with the data that we have today, wrong. Most of the data that we have today suggests that fertility does not stop falling at 2.1. It continues to fall, well, it can fall as low as 1.28 or 1.28 in, I believe, Korea at one point. I think it's about 1.44 in Japan today. In a lot of Europe, it's around 1.5 to 1.6. Some places are 1.7. I believe the only developed country actually that's well over 2 is the United States. And that's in large part because different ethnic groups in the United States have different, much higher numbers of children. I should say different ethnic and religious groups have more children than the population at large. Apologies. So you might be thinking again, why are we talking about this? Why does this matter today for those of us looking at global governance in the Asia Pacific? Who cares? We care, because our working age populations are going to shrink. Here in Japan, they've already shrank, but they're going to shrink more. And South Korea and China are both going to be facing a very similar prospect. So here on the left, we have the number of people and millions of people for the working age population. So you can see in China, from 2000 to 2060, you'll see China is going to peak in about a decade and then start falling fairly rapidly. South Korea is this blue line here. It's kind of hard to read because China and India distort the graph for everybody else, but Japan and South Korea are both falling actually fairly rapidly. The slopes on these lines are actually pretty extreme. It's just, again, hard to see. And then the US and Indonesia are both on the upswing. And the source for all of this is the Organization for Economic, well, the OECD. And then if we look at the share of pensioners age 65 or over, the colors are mostly the same. We see that in China, the red line, they're going way up. We see that in Japan, which is the light blue line, it's at it's going to hit almost 40% of the population. And I would actually say that this graph is conservative in the sense that it's actually going to be worse than this. But you'll see that in almost every country, the share of pensioners over the age of 65 is increasing. And one of the important things to note about this graph here on the right is that it's not limited just to developed countries. You have some developing countries like Vietnam and Thailand that are actually aging very, very rapidly and will soon approach the levels that, well, not soon, but by 2060, they'll be approaching the levels that Japan was at in 2015, which is pretty scary because that means that their window for their optimal window for economic development is, well, I don't want to say it's closing, but it's maybe shorter than they would like. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit, actually a lot of it, today about the Japanese case because that's the one that I'm most familiar with. So a great book that exists on this topic that I would encourage all of you to read because it's a quick read, it's an easy read. It's about 250 pages, which sounds long, but I promise you, not only does it go very, very fast, but you can also just read sections of chapters and pull out useful information. This book is available in both English and Japanese. It's one of my most recommended books. It's written by, it was authored by the Asia Pacific Initiative and edited by their director, Yoichi Funabashi. And it describes, well, Japan's population implosion, the 50 million shock, which is to say that by 2100, Japan's population is projected to fall to as low as 50 million people if nothing is done. And this book takes this problem that is, again, according to them, Japan's population implosion, and it breaks it down into both the problems that have led to this, into what has led to this, and where do we go from here. And essentially says that it's an existential crisis that's tied to a lot of Japan's other major problems. Hold on, give me 1 second. Okay, so one of my favorite quotes from the book is that of Japan's numerous policy failures over the past 30 years, the failure of crafting an effective population policy is by far the greatest. And they actually put the threat to Japan's social and economic stability as on par with those that sparked the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Which is to say that they view the threat as being very, very serious, probably the most serious threat that Japan has faced since the inception of its modern state in the 19th century. Their hypothesis is that Japan is essentially trapped in a series, a series of negative chain reactions that stunt economic growth and hollow out industry, while also eroding Japan's influence in the region and the world, undermine, distort, and ultimately destroy the social contract, and could lead to a catastrophic economic collapse here in Japan that could also lead to a global recession, given how vital Japan is to the global economy and the global supply chain. So I want to take a moment to just explain kind of what they mean when they say a negative chain reaction. Now this is actually something I made, and you can tell because it's kind of crappy compared to most of their really nice charts and graphs, but what is a negative chain reaction? Well, in this case, if you look at, you have an aging labor force which has decreasing productivity, a rising dependency ratio, meaning that the cost for caring for the elderly is increasing quite rapidly. And you have relatively weak consumer and business demand, which is to say both consumers and businesses, because the labor force is aging, they don't see a lot of need to spend. This leads to slow growth because when people aren't spending money and the government has to spend an increasing amount of money on pensioners who aren't contributing as much to the economy, it's going to slow down growth. And this, of course, eventually leads to fiscal instability as the government is increasingly unable to maintain any kind of fiscal discipline. It leads to wage stagnation because when the labor force is less competitive and when demand is not rising, employers generally do not see a need to increase wages. And this can lead to what's called deflation, which is when assets are actually losing value over time. And deflation is the problem that Japan's really been fighting since the bubble collapsed in the late 1980s, which is to say that the value of things like land and other commodities has actually generally decreased or stayed flat since that time instead of increasing. Deflation is really interesting. If I go back and I look at prices for commodities in America back when I was a young child, they're generally quite different than they are today. But if I go back and look at commodity prices in Japan, they tend to be the same, which is weird because the value of the yen is way, way higher today than it was, well, whenever it was that I was back in the 90s. Basically, it's even things cost the same amount of money even though the yen is worth more, which means that in real terms those assets are actually selling for far less than they were selling for 20 years ago. So that's deflation. And then finally, this leads both consumers and businesses to be pessimistic about the economic prospects for the future, which further contributes to the low birth rate, which further contributes to the aging society. It contributes to a lack of investment because when businesses don't see an opportunity for growth, they are unwilling to invest money in their employees or in their, or in equipment. And of course, it leads to risk aversion. Both, again, consumers and businesses look to make money in the ways that they made it in the past. And so then that starts the cycle again until you eventually get some kind of socioeconomic collapse. Either the government becomes unable to continue to fund existing pension obligations and has to radically restructure them, or the economy for some reason becomes unable to absorb, for example, say Japanese government bonds, which this will make more sense when I explain it a few slides later. But the point is, at some point, this becomes unsustainable. This can only go on for so long before Japan faces a crisis scenario. So another really interesting idea that's brought up in this book is something called the deterioration of life infrastructure. And so what this means, first and foremost, life infrastructure is defined as the core public and private services that people rely on to lead healthy, modern, and productive lives. So we're talking about things like the public transportation infrastructure, roads, schools, telecommunications, banking, housing, construction, local government, and even just facilities where they can shop, where they can buy groceries. These are all different forms of life infrastructure. However, what happens when you have a declining population is that you have, again, a negative chain reaction. You have shrinking communities, mean that a decreasing number of people are utilizing these services. Because a decreasing number of people are utilizing these services, the services have reduced viability. Because the services have reduced viability, providers scale back or eliminate operations. And then because the number of services available in the region decreases, this causes more people to leave the community. And as more people leave the community, this perpetuates the cycle. So again, as communities shrink, the number of people using services decreases, the service becomes less viable, and thus scales back its operations. Because the service's operations are scaled back, people living in those communities decide that those communities are now unlivable and move out, and as this continues to happen, it will hollow out the region in which it's taking place. So this deterioration of life infrastructure, or in some regions they actually call it a collapse. They actually kind of chart the number of businesses and other functions in certain areas and then define deterioration and collapse. But collapse, not just deterioration, has actually begun in parts of even Tokyo, which is to say that the Tokyo metropolitan area is very large. It actually encompasses a wide variety of different urban and rural landscapes. It isn't all just, 50-foot tall skyscrapers. And so, of course, there are areas in Tokyo that are still doing very well, and you don't see any of this. But particularly if you go to some of Tokyo's more outlying areas, or if you, of course, go outside of Tokyo or other major cities, you can see this deterioration of life infrastructure. So this graph is probably a little bit hard to read, and so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time using it as a basis for talks. But what I really just want to point out about this graph, what this graph is saying is that it's charting with a bar the percentage of facilities that don't, the percentage of areas that have, I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little bit this morning. So the darker bar graph is the percentage of facilities not meeting what's called the trading area population requirement in 2010, which is to say that these are areas that in 2010 had already begun to see collapse in their life infrastructure. And then the lighter bar graph is the percentage of those facilities that are predicted to exist in 2040. So between 2010 and 2040, this charts it by prefecture on the bottom, and then the line is the degree of increase. What you see is that in many parts of Japan, in many prefectures, you're going to have a very, very large increase in the percentage of areas that become unable to support kind of productive modern urban or even rural life. And that's a problem, a huge problem. So I want to take a moment now and say, what does this mean for Japan's national budget? Because I mentioned the budget earlier. Just quick show of hands for those of you here in Japan. How many of you have ever bothered to look at the Japanese government's yearly budget? Anyone? No? Anyone I can't really see you guys, so very well, but anyone at Yonsei for them maybe? Not really? Okay. Well, it's terrifying if you live in Japan. You should be terrified. I'm terrified. So here's the budget for the fiscal year of 2018. So on the left, you have the Japanese government's expenditures. So this is money going out. And what you'll see is that Social Security, so mostly elder care, makes up a third of the budget in 2018. And then if you look on the kind of the left side of this blue graph, you'll see that National Debt Service, servicing Japan's national debt, makes up almost a quarter of the budget. So just between those two, that's over half the budget. There's another really big problem, which is that if you look on the right, you'll see general account revenue. Where does the money for this spending come from? Well, 60% of it comes from taxes, but 34.5%, over a third of the government's funding, in 2018 came from issuing new debt. Remember, a quarter of the money that they spend ends up going towards servicing their existing debt. So Japan's basically in a debt trap. It has to borrow money to pay for the money that it spent in the money that it borrowed in previous years. It's actually borrowing more than its existing debt. So it's not a long-term sustainable situation. And then this is actually the budget for 2019. So in 2019, the budget has been revised in part because the consumption tax, sorry, I'm probably walking out of the camera's view, but the consumption tax was increased to 10%. So, that should help a little bit, right? Well, a little bit, yes. It helps a little bit in that the tax revenue has gone up from, I think it's about 60%. Yeah, 60.5% last year. This year it's now 61.6%, which is it's an appreciable increase, but for revenue, government bond issuance, so issuance of new debt, is still 32.2%. And of course, servicing the national debt is still very expensive. Social Security is still very expensive. And you're probably just like, oh my God, this is a lot of numbers. Why are you showing me this at 10 in the morning? Like, stop. But the point I want you to take away is that Japan's budget is being slowly devoured by Social Security and servicing the national debt, in large part because Japan is not taking in enough revenue to fund the spending that it's doing. I should make a quick note here that Japan's debt to GDP ratio is over 250% of gross domestic product, which is higher than any other developed nation, and I think most developing nations as well. It's very serious. Most of the debt is held domestically. Japanese investors in the last 30 years since the bubble collapse tend to be very conservative, so they like to buy government bonds to kind of just stuff cash under the mattress for a rainy day. Which is to say they're not investing money, they're just basically lending it to the government for a very, 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 very small return. But if those companies were to one day decide, hey, I'd like to get a higher return on my investment. I'm tired of investing in Japanese government bonds and getting, a very small return. I want to invest elsewhere. The government would have to, it'd have to pay international market rate for its borrowing. And then this national debt service figure would expand quite rapidly. So right now, Japan's borrowing money from domestic investors who are really pretty willing to just to use the Japanese government kind of like a bank. We can put our money here and it'll be safe, but we're not going to make a lot on it. Okay, so some of you may have heard of a program called Abenomics, which is the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, when he came to power in 2012, he talked about revising the economy, increasing taxes, and just a whole set of programs that would help Japan escape deflation and get back to the path of growth, and everything would be good. So let's assume for a moment that Abenomics was successful. At this point in time in 2019, after roughly 7 years of Abenomics, I don't know that a lot of people would really agree with that statement, but let's just say for argument's sake that Abenomics worked and that Japan was growing at 2% every year, which I need to say that it's not. But let's just say that it is for a second. So the consumption tax, the sales tax here in Japan, some of you may again be aware that it was raised from 8 to 10% this last, actually just about a month ago. The problem with that is that it was meant to help address, again, those funding issues that I just talked about. But even if Abenomics was successful and Japan was growing at 2% every year, if we actually wanted to balance the Japanese government budget, the consumption tax would have to be raised to about 32.5% if it was to be raised in steps. Yeah, exactly. We got some laughter over here. Yes, that was my response when I first saw this graph. I was like, "You're kidding, right? Like, it's impossible. This is electoral suicide. Like, no politician is going to be like, hey, let's raise the consumption tax to 35% over the next, 15 years or 20 years. It's unimaginable. And this graph goes out to like 2087, 2098. This is a very, very long graph. But basically what they're talking about is that the consumption tax would be raised to over 30% by 2050, which is, again, it's insane. But the reality is that if Japan doesn't make any serious changes, this is the only way forward, really, for balancing the budget, unless they come up with some other magical source of revenue or somehow manage to get economic growth back up to 3, 4, 5%. So the situation is quite serious. And then, as I said, public debt in Japan is very serious. At 250, this graph actually only charts to 2010, so it only goes up to about 220%. I believe it's now over 250%. The point is that it exceeds the peak, the World War II peak. At the end of World War II, in fiscal 1944, Japan's debt to GDP ratio was about 200%, just over 200. We've now increased that by about another 20% today. So that's how serious the fiscal situation is. It's worse than Japan's fiscal situation was in 1944 when it was losing the most serious war in its history. So what's the prognosis? What can Japan do? What should Japan do? Well, unfortunately, while there is no time to waste in addressing the issue, Japan has actually already missed the window for proactive, preventative action. If Japan had been acting proactively in the 90s, the 2000s, then this issue could have been addressed before it got this serious. Unfortunately, because it was not, most of what has to take place today is corrective measures, which is to say that even if, and I'll be talking about this a little bit more on a later slide, even if fertility were to recover to replacement rate today, the population would still continue to fall for many, many years, just because of the large number of seniors that we have today. However, one of the solutions proposed by the authors a solution that I personally really heavily endorse, is that one of Japan's major structural problems, which I think is very family unfriendly, is the sense of fatigue engendered by workers in Japan with long commutes, extensive overtime, and ambiguous personnel evaluation systems. I actually worked corporate here in Japan for about 5 years, and it was an eye-opening and interesting experience, but I definitely felt that it wasn't family-friendly, and that there's a lot of work that could be done to make the system work better for people here. So just to give you a few more kind of statistics, this one is one I find frightening, which is that here in Japan, the number of people over 70 actually exceed the number of people under 14. And the number of people over 65 doubles the number of people under 14. So that's how serious the aging crisis is here. The older generation is twice as large as the current young generation. And so the question is very much, how can this small population of young people support this very large number of elderly? However, this isn't just Japan's problem. And that's not just because, as I said, Japan's economy is very integrated into the world economy. You know, if Japan's economy were to collapse, it would be probably a global financial crisis. Some people have said it would be worse than the 2008 financial crisis if Japan's economy were to collapse, and worse by several magnitudes of degree. But that's not the only reason it's a problem for not just Japan. China, Korea, and actually much of Europe and even parts of Southeast Asia are actually aging very rapidly. And China and Korea in particular are aging much faster than Japan did. So the United States is probably of all the developed countries, is probably in the best position demographically. And that's why we're using it as a reference here against China. But if we look at the Chinese and US populations in 2020, and then compare them to what they're projected to look like in 2060, using the United Nations Population Division's low estimate forecast, we can see that today the Chinese population stands at 1.43 billion people. The median age is 38.4 years. The number of people between 0 and 24 years makes up roughly a third of the population, while those over 65 make up only 12% of the population today. In the United States, you can see that there's the median age is roughly the same at 38.3. And that in and of itself is a very interesting figure because it shows you just how old really China is. Because the United States, while being the youngest of the developed nations demographically, has also aged over time in the sense that the median age has risen from being in the 20s to the early 30s to the upper 30s. In Japan, the median age is now well over, the median age is close to 50, which I'll show you in a minute. But so it's actually really interesting that China and the U.S. have the same median age. But the population of young people in the U.S. is a little bit larger than China, and then the number of people over 65 is at 16.6%, so it's still larger in the United States. But if you look at the two population lines, you'll see that China's population starts to, actually I should probably stand over here, to decrease, while the US population just slowly, just ever so slightly increases based on this prediction. And if we look at 2060, the median age in China is 53.1. The number of people 0 to 24 is 17.8%, and the number of people over 65 will be over a third of the population. The US, obviously, the situation isn't as great as it is today, but it's not nearly as bad as it is in China. And one thing I should note about this, what's called the UNPD low fertility forecast, is that it's probably, if nothing is done, it's relatively accurate for China. But it's probably actually a little bit pessimistic for the United States. The United States' position is forecasted to actually be a little bit better than this, although this is still a relatively good barometer of how things will look. And then here's Korea and Japan, which are both really depressing cases. I'm not going to break down the numbers quite as well because I'm probably going to run out of time, but the main takeaway is that both populations are actually already beginning to fall and falling very quickly. They're both going to, Japan's population will fall to potentially as low as 87 million by 2060, while Korea could be at 38 million in 2060. Japan today, the median age is approaching 50 years of age. It's at 48.4. And as I've already said, the number of people over 65 exceeds the number of people under 24 significantly. And it's only projected to get worse. By 2060 in Japan, the median age will be approaching 60 years of age, while the number of people over 65 will be not quite triple the number of people under 24. As I've said, Korea is also aging very, very rapidly. The median age is actually already exceeded that of the United States and is beginning to approach that of Japan at 43.7 years. That said, the number of people who are 0 to 24 is similar, but the number of people over age 65 is still only 15.8%, which is still beginning to get up there. But if we look at, this is actually 2060, sorry, I forgot to adjust the numbers, but in 2060, the median age in South Korea is going to be 62.5 years of age. This is higher than Japan. The number of people 0 to 24 is 11.9%, and the number of people age 65 and over is 45.9%. That means that there would be 4 times as many people over 65 as there are under 24. So, the regional implication here is that really aging threatens regional economic growth and stability. And even if fertility were to recover tomorrow, let's just say that from tomorrow, every couple in Japan and Korea, well, everyone in Japan, Korea, and China decided that, hey, we're all going to get married. And they all decided that they're all going to have 2 to 3 children. Even if that were to happen from tomorrow, they would still face massive aging-related challenges. And of course, the fertility rate isn't actually going to recover like that. It's going to be a much more complicated process if it recovers at all. In China, you have the question of growing old before growing rich. This is an argument you'll hear a lot about in the discourse about China's economic development. And in Korea, it's facing the challenge that while it's managed to achieve high income status, the amount of time it's spent in high income status kind of building up assets before it hit its kind of rapid aging phase is much shorter than Japan's. And so in a lot of ways, I think Korea will enter kind of the aged phase with a lot less, you might say, societal savings than Japan has had. And in Southeast Asia, while fertility tends to be higher and populations tend to be younger, as I mentioned in the beginning, you also have some populations like Thailand and Vietnam, which are aging very rapidly. Singapore is a high-income country with a similar kind of aging profile to that of Japan and Korea. And so it isn't just a Northeast Asian challenge. And of course, a lot of European countries are facing a similar, if less severe, problem. Now, of course, some of you may be thinking, well, yeah, but migration. We can just, Japan can just stop being a closed society and accept more immigrants and problem solved. Well, not exactly. First and foremost, Japan in particular is still very much in the process of building a kind of societal system that can accept a larger number of migrants. And it's not there yet. And it's going to take a long time, or at least a good deal of time, I think, to get there. However, even if it is able to get there relatively quickly, let's say that Japan is able to build a system that can accept more immigrants within the next 5 to 10 years, there is some other problems that are very significant, which is to say that immigration alone really can't solve Northeast Asia's problems, in large part because building demographically sustainable societies isn't just a numbers game. It's not just about saying, okay, how can we increase the number of 18-year-olds? How can we increase the number of 24-year-olds? How can we make people have more kids? It's about saying, how can we ensure that our society is economically sustainable and that our populations are satisfied? If you increase the number of migrants or immigrants living in a society, but you don't provide for them, you don't integrate them, then you can end up with a lot of social discord. You can end up with a backlash from the native population. You can have all kinds of issues. And of course, in every country where this is taking place, you're going to see massive budgetary pressure and really kind of budgetary competition, where you have spending on the elderly competing with spending for families, and also spending for immigration. And this is going to crowd out other spending. It's going to make spending on other things that society needs very hard. It also means that because every country in Northeast Asia, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, and of course much of Europe and even parts of the United States are dealing with a similar demographic crisis, the competition for skilled immigrants is actually going to be quite severe in the coming years, which is to say that even if Japan flings its doors open, even if Korea flings its doors open, it doesn't mean that people are going to come. They might look and say, yeah, Japan's a nice place, but I'd rather live somewhere else. There's lots of other options for me that seem more welcoming or otherwise more attractive. So since this is the Wednesday class, I do want to talk briefly about security, and I wanted to talk a bit more about this, so if you have questions about this aspect, feel free to ask me after class or during the Q&A. But so there's generally, I think, two ways of thinking about how is this aging process going to impact the security dynamics here in the Asia Pacific. In my mind, the first one is what we call geriatric peace. And this is the idea that you've probably heard the argument guns versus butter before, which is to say that societies often have to make a choice between do we want to spend money on the military or do we want to spend money on consumer goods, on social security, on things that make people's lives actively better in our society. And so we replaced butter, in this case, with wheelchairs, because as the number of elderly increases, the amount of money that has to be spent on taking care of them will also subsequently increase and will increasingly compete for spending that the military would otherwise want to commandeer. So military budgets will also end up being crowded out. And particularly here in Japan, you sometimes hear people, especially in other countries, think that, well, Japan's going to revise its constitution and it's gonna build up a big military again and do I don't know what, but here's the secret. Japan doesn't have any money for that. Japan spends every dime it can on its seniors, and those seniors, they vote, and so it's going to continue doing so for the foreseeable future. And I see a similar trend potentially in Korea and China and in other countries that face this phenomenon. And then, of course, with an increasingly small population of working age people, societies are also going to be much more reluctant to send those young people into harm's way because the number of people who can support the large elderly population is increasingly small. Now, another way I think you can think about this, and a way to reframe it, is actually the tyranny of the aged. And this is to say that particularly in democratic societies, but not only in democratic societies, as the number of elderly, or not even just elderly, but older people in their later 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s and up increase, society becomes more conservative. It may become more concerned with old prejudices. And this could inflame historical disputes, territorial disputes, and other problems that could actually spiral into military action. And this is because, again, for people who are older, these issues matter more. If you look at surveys of who cares the most about these kind of issues of national pride, it's generally the older generation that cares more. And even in countries where the younger generation seems to be very invested, I believe that might be because, again, there's such a large number of elders kind of pushing these ideas onto them and saying that this is important, you need to care about this. And so you have young people who then kind of take on their parents' or their grandparents' prejudices and make them their own. And then, of course, you also just have, again, the kind of dominance of older people in decision-making, which could, again, potentially, as I said, lead to a more aggressive foreign policy, or alternatively, if all the spending, let's say, doesn't go towards the military, but goes to, older people, it goes to spending on Social Security, you may end up with youth who feel very alienated because they feel like society's resources are not being directed at their needs. And when that happens, you could have alienated youth acting out in countries across the region, again, because they feel like society is unfair to them. And this could cause its own form of social and regional instability that is just as dangerous as kind of state-level military action. So I want to leave time for discussion, so I'm just kind of going to briefly touch on these last few things. So China is a very interesting case, in particular because you have the legacy of the one-child policy, which is probably, in fact, it's not probably, who am I kidding? The one-child policy is the largest experiment in demographic engineering that has ever been attempted in human history. And you could argue it's been very successful. It brought China's birth rate down rapidly over a period of several decades. In fact, it's brought China from high fertility to low fertility within basically the span of a generation. And it's actually ingrained a low fertility preference. And now that the one-child policy, it's been repealed, and China may be saying, well, you can have more kids now, but that doesn't mean that people are going to do so. They may have just accelerated the trend that kind of naturally exists, and there may not be a way to reverse it. And then it's also led to, as I think some of you are probably aware, a gender imbalance that could have its own very serious consequences. And then, of course, you have the issue that the pension system in China, at least it's my understanding, is that it's less developed than in some of the other countries in the region, and that, just generally speaking, now is a very critical time for China's economic development. If it doesn't want to become stuck in the middle income trap, it needs to keep growing. But precisely at the time that it needs to keep growing, these aging issues are going to become increasingly salient for both policymakers, policymakers of all stripes. So, I want to talk really quickly about North Korea, because this is kind of one of my ideas, and some of you can agree with it or disagree with it, but depending on what happens with North Korea over the next few decades, I think it has the potential to really kind of reshape the demographic landscape of Northeast Asia. Because if Korean reunification were to be achieved, or if broad-scale liberalization within North Korea were achieved, you could have thousands or even millions of people looking to migrate. Now, this is often seen as a potential crisis. You hear about, China supports North Korea because it doesn't want to have a large number of refugees on its border. You hear about the costs that would be incurred by South Korea in the event of reunification. But in a lot of ways, North Korea has a younger population of people who are relatively skilled, who could probably integrate fairly well into Japan, South Korea, well, of course South Korea, and then Japan, and then also, to a degree, China. And so, in many ways, this could alleviate some of the demographic pressure that we have here in Northeast Asia. And at the same time, remittances, which is to say sending money back home, as well as skill transfer, could also help kind of rebuild the North Korean economy over time, again, in the event that this were to happen. So this is kind of a potential policy trifecta for aging policy, which is that really there's three legs. You have aging policy, which is dealing with the population of the elderly, so kind of increasing people's productive lifespans, as well as streamlining the cost of elder care. You have migration policy, which is, what it sounds like, both accepting more migrants, integrating those migrants, and then, of course, attracting and retaining them. And then you have family policy. How do we get people to have more balanced families? How do we increase work-life balance? How do we prioritize and not only encourage, but really mandate parental leave? And then, is it even possible to incentivize people to have more children? Is it even desirable to do so? And the conclusion really here is that demographic policy is hard. because the time horizons are so long, which is to say that because demographic policy tends to take place over not 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 years, but 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades, it's very hard even for policymakers to fully grasp the long-term implications of their decisions, let alone for everyday kind of average citizens to understand the ways in which these decisions interact and the impacts that they'll have over time. And then, I talked a lot about fertility today, but one of the things that, I want to, of course, mention in the closing is that, fertility it's a basic human right, it's a choice, and it's not necessarily the purview of the government to tell people how many children to have, at least in my personal opinion. And so there's very much an argument about whether or not this is even an area where the government should be kind of sticking its nose in. In fact, here in Japan, part of the reason that there really hasn't been any kind of population policy in the last since the end of World War II is that there was a population policy before World War II. And it was very controversial in Japan after the war. And so bureaucrats and politicians made a conscious decision to say, this is the purview of individuals to make their own decisions, and it's not an area where we should be really kind of actively trying to get people to do things. Which leads into kind of the final point on this note, which is that people aren't statistics. In demography, people are, often kind of categorized, but really, they're not statistics. People have their own dreams, they have their own aspirations, and they're going to act in ways that public policy cannot anticipate, or at least does not want to anticipate. They're not going to act in the optimal way that public policy would like them to act. And so we have to build policies that can work around individual choices. One example that I want to give is that I was talking to one of a colleague of mine at a conference, and I brought up this issue of aging in Japan and of creating an environment more hospitable to migrants coming from other countries. And he said, oh, well, Jonathan, no, here's the problem. You see, we took these migrants from Southeast Asia for this one program, and we brought them over to Japan, and we sent them into these kind of really local rural areas. And what do you know, these darn people, they're just not satisfied coming into Japan. They want to come and live in Tokyo, but we need them to live in the rural area. But they don't want to live in the rural area. They say, if I have to live in the rural area, I'd rather go home. And, I was kind of looking at him incredulously thinking, well, yeah, of course, because they're not numbers on a spreadsheet, just like anybody else, they want to live in the center of Japan. They want to live in the exciting part of Japan. They don't want to be stuck in the countryside, helping to necessarily rebuild a rural village, or at least not without, the proper incentives. So, again, people don't always act in the way that that policymakers would like them to. And again, this is something that you have to design policy around. And then a few just quick closing thoughts, which is that some of you may have been listening to this lecture thinking, well, what about AI? What about emerging technology? Because a lot of people are asking the question, is population even relevant anymore? And in an era where we are moving rapidly towards self-driving cars, is it not possible that a lot of the labor that is done today could be done by computer systems or robots in a decade or so? And the answer to that question is that, well, for one, nobody knows, because we can't look into the future. But we can look back towards the past. And if we look back towards the past, at least what I see looking back at the past is that people said the same things about industrialization, about mechanization, about kind of the early developments of computers in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. People have said really since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that work is going to disappear, that this is going to make human work obsolete, and humans, what are we going to do with all of our free time? But it hasn't happened yet. We've always found a way to create new types of work for people to do, new ways for people to fill their time. And so while I'm not saying that this time won't be the exception, because it certainly could be. It certainly could be that we're reaching a new stage of human development that is very different than the previous stages. But it could also just be that AI will kind of unleash a new era in which people do different kinds of work than they do today. So, at least in my own personal opinion, I think that dealing with the demographic issue is something that we have to take seriously, and we cannot just write off because, oh, AI will save us, or robotics will save us, or some other emerging technology will save us. No, we have to make the assumption that at the very least, it's necessary to stabilize the population, to stabilize government finances, based on rational assumptions that we can make today. So I want to thank you all for your time. I apologize that the lecture started a little bit late, and I am opening the floor for questions.
Mr. Jamal, thank you for your lecture. Okay. There is some questions from Yazir.
Okay.
Start.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you for the lecture, and I want to know that I see Japan has a huge defect in their government income, and even they have a very low Gini index. So I think yes, can Abenomics can help deal with their distribution. Indeed, I think it's an unfair distribution between the aging population and the young people. I think, and do you think they spend too much money on the aging population, and they should try to encourage young people to get work and to help increase their babies? Yes.
Yeah. So my answer to your question is that Abenomics has talked a good game about making things easier for families and increasing spending on issues that are important to workers and families. But the reality is that it hasn't been that successful. You can tell by looking at the lineup of Japanese cabinet ministers, where there's still usually one token woman, if that. But more than anything else, if you have time, I recommend that you read the book, Japan's Population Implosion, because it actually talks about that budgetary issue that you just mentioned, which is that should Japan spend less on its aging population and more on its on its family programs? And the answer is that actually it doesn't have to make that choice, as funny as it sounds, because on the one hand, yes, Japan's government the budget is very limited, but here's the thing. Japan actually spends a very small percentage of its budget relative to other developed countries on family-related spending. I believe Japan's family-related spending is roughly half of that of France, and so Japan could actually double its family spending and not even really increase its budget by all that much. There's a good deal of kind of wiggle room in the Japanese budget where money could be taken from other areas. So family spending could be increased actually. I don't want to say easily, because it's always a challenge when you shuffle money around, but it could definitely be done. And yes, if you have to make a choice between spending more on the elderly and spending more on families, I think Japan needs to choose to spend more on families if it wants to secure its future. Thank you. We have one question here at KO, so I'm going to shift to her real quick.
So what do you think is the leading socio or cultural factor for the low birth rate in Japan, and what can we do as civilians, or what should the Japanese system do to tackle this issue?
So my personal opinion is that I think the system of work here is one of the biggest deterrents to people having the family size that they want to have. If you look at surveys, most couples want to have at least 2 children, if not more. It's just that they're not, one, they're not able to. And then two, you have a lot of people who want to get married, but they can't. They have an inability to find a partner. And in my personal opinion, a large part of the reason for that is that most, not even just corporate jobs, but a lot of even non-corporate jobs in Japan, they will literally devour all of your time. They demand all of your time. They demand overtime. And so you have no time to meet anybody. Or if you do meet somebody and manage to get married, you really don't have the time to have more than one child. And if you're a woman, every child that you have, let's say you have a high-powered corporate career. I had several female colleagues who were extremely capable. For every child they had, they were delaying their career by 2 to 3 years. So if you have 2 children, you're now 6 to 7 years behind your male peers in terms of your corporate progression. Yes. And so in my mind, while there are certainly lots of other issues that would need to be tackled for Japan's fertility rate to rise, I think the most pressing of them is the issue of creating a more family-friendly working environment and creating a society that values family more than it values work. Next question.
Yes, I have a question here from Fudan. One aspect of the entire question of budget is, how do I say, tax dodging. Like, if you're going to have a society which provides for the elderly and such, you have to have a budget, you have to have money, right? But in a society like Sweden, which has similar issues as Japan and South Korea with the aging population, I think we're losing about 13 billion euros a year on tax dodgers.
Could you speak up
issue.
just a little bit? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. That's much better.
Sorry. Yeah. So in Sweden, for example, which has similar issues to Japan and South Korea, we have an issue of tax dodging, where about 13 billion euros is lost yearly, I think, from the budget. Does South Korea and Japan have similar issues, or is it
Tax dodging in Sweden?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Definitely.
I'm not an expert on Japan or South Korea's tax law, particularly not South Korea. I don't know that Japan has. As far as I know, Japan does not necessarily have a really serious issue with tax evasion in the kind of Euro-American sense, but Japan does have a lot of problems with corporations hoarding cash. I remember, like, my company used to brag about how much money they had in the bank, which that's just money that's sitting there. It's not being taxed. It's not being put to any productive economic use. It's literally just sitting in the bank doing nothing. And so, while I don't know that Japan has the same issues of tax evasion, it definitely has a lot of very serious problems with money that is just parked in bank accounts, sitting there doing nothing. But as far as I know, tax evasion itself is not, as far as I know, it's not a very serious problem here in Japan, at least not, again, in the same sense that it is in Europe or America. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you. One more question, April Fulton.
Thank you very much. I know that you mentioned, that you said that immigration is not the most important way to tackle the demographic issue, but I was just wondering, in your opinion, do you think sort of programs such as like the JET program and the MEXT program could be good ways for Japan to, get carrot sticks to, encourage more immigration into the country, or do you think they're mostly just, short-term, grad schemes that essentially don't encourage people to stay?
Okay, so I want to kind of dissect your question a little bit. So as to your first point, I think that migration is a central piece of the puzzle. I think that encouraging more immigration to Japan, as well as the other countries of Northeast Asia, is a critical piece of solving the demographic issue. I myself am originally from the United States. and I've chosen to come and live in Japan, and I want Japan to succeed, and I want Japan to become a society that is more open and accepting of immigrants. So I want to emphasize that it's not that I don't think it's important. I do. I think it's very important. It's just that I think that a lot of people tend to just think that immigrants can solve everything when they can't, because the number of immigrants that Japan would have to take in to fill the hole that's left by the number of people who are the number of elderly who are passing away every year, it would be something like a million people every year, or at the very least several 100,000 people every year, which is far more than Japan can handle at the present moment, and would cause, at least right now, a massive amount of social discord. And so I feel that the Japanese population needs to stabilize first, well, not necessarily first, but needs to be stabilized at the same time that more migrants are being accepted. And also Japan needs to do the work to create social systems to support people who come to this country to live and work, to integrate them into society so that they don't feel alienated, and so that they, I've had the privilege of growing up in the U.S. and studying Japanese as an elective, and coming here to study abroad. And I've spent a lot of time and money to be able to come and live and work in Japanese society, kind of like a Japanese person does. But not everybody has that kind of privilege. And so Japan needs to create a system where people who might want to come from developing countries can have the opportunity to come and be successful and have their children be successful. And then finally, to address what you said about JET and other programs, I believe that these programs have been crucial starting points for Japan's kind of globalization and diversification. But most of them have very serious kind of shortcomings that need to be addressed going forward. Although I don't want to go too deep into that, because that would be its own long discussion. But those programs are important, but they need to be revised in light of very much changed circumstances from the 1980s and the 1970s when they were first introduced. Thank you.
One question from Yanze. Hear me? Okay.
Speak on anyway.
Okay. My understanding is that the development of AI is likely to further decrease the fertility rate, as people may worry about the number of jobs replaced by the AI. So, do you think the government should take the technological development into consideration, for example, as one of the potential policies, other than aging policy, family policy, and migration policy?
Thank you. So sorry. I think that, of course, staying ahead of emerging technology is always going to be a key priority for the government. And I do think that there is potential for AI and similar technological breakthroughs to kind of revolutionize human productivity, or the amount of work that can be done with the same amount of people. And so yes, on the one hand, I do think that it's very important for I do think that it's a possible way to mitigate the demographic challenge. Yes, if AI allows us to replace a lot of jobs with automation, this may not be so much a problem as a solution. But even then, you have the question of who owns this technology, who's profiting off of this technology, because Japan, Korea, the U.S., and really China, because we're market economies. Companies are going to most likely own these resources. And so then you have to face the question of, okay, so are we taxing these companies more? Are we implementing a universal basic income? I think it's a fascinating angle from which to approach it, but if AI is really going to revolutionize work and is going to make it so that most people don't have to work, we then have to ask the question of what are people going to do, and how is the government going to kind of restructure society around that. So yes, I do think that that's something the government needs to consider, but I also don't think that it's something that we should bet our future on. It's certainly possible that AI will make it so that humans don't have to work, but it's also possible that AI just changes the nature of human work, and we still need a large number of people to carry out that work.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Fudan. Or actually two. So I was thinking about if you can elaborate a bit about the role of youth policies, like policies or organization that could help like young people to get jobs, like master jobs, because there are still like a lot of people that are unemployed in like a lot of countries. And also if you could, like you already touched upon it a bit, but if you can elaborate about like equality policies, because there's like many societies where the culture is that the woman is staying home and taking care of the children, and they're like representing the half of the world population. Like, yeah. Thanks.
Sorry, you mentioned equality at the end. Can you go back and just restate your first point really quickly? Because
Yeah, like the youth policies, like
policy.
what is the role of that? Like, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then like equality
Equality
policies.
policy. Okay. So for youth policy, I think that here in Japan, we need to work towards a society that helps people do what they are happy doing and what they want to do, instead of just funneling them into what is societally considered the best option for them, letting them have more options and more choices. Japan does not have a particularly high unemployment rate, but I would personally make the argument that it has a pretty high unhappy employment rate, which is to say that there's a lot of people who are unhappily employed here. And I think that for Japan, addressing that issue of people who are unhappily employed and making sure that youth can get into jobs that they're going to find satisfying and that they're going to give them the time to eventually raise a family or even just pursue whatever interest they may have, is going to be critical. As for those countries that are having trouble placing youth in employment, I think that there's probably work that needs to be done on economic development, on job matching programs. I'm not an expert in that field necessarily, but I think there's some cases in maybe Singapore that might be relevant, but I'd have to get back to you on that specific point. But as for equality, yes, there is so much work to be done in terms of equalizing the workplace. And just to give you an example of my own experience in Japan, I had a manager once who he married within the company. I knew both him and his wife, and she took 2 years off when she had their child, their first child. And I think she took 2 years off when she had their second child as well. He took, I think, maybe 2 or 3 days for the first child, and then he took half a day for the second child. And then he had the audacity to one time ask me, yeah, my wife's really mad at me recently, and I can't figure out why. It kind of blew my mind. So, yeah, I think that one of the steps we need to take here in Japan is changing the way of thinking from maternity leave to parental leave. Because until both mothers and fathers are both taking the same amount of time off to take care of children, it's going to be impossible for women to stand on the same footing within the workplace. Hopefully that addresses your question. Anyone else want to bring? Oh, yeah, we have one here. Oh, wait. Do we have? Okay, so yeah, go ahead. And then,
Okay. And can you hear me clearly?
Yes,
And
yes,
thank
I
you
can.
for your lecture. Yeah. I have a question. As the economy develops in China, women become more independent, and many young people don't want to marry and don't want to have children. And on the internet, this phenomenon called lazy marriage, so that the population of the future will grow smaller and more aging. So what about Japan, and what do you think about this phenomenon?
I think it's very interesting because, as I kind of
Yeah.
mentioned briefly in the lecture, in Japan we have the opposite problem, which is that you have a lot of people who, according to surveys, want to get married but fail to do so. They're unable to find a partner. You also have a lot of people who, again, would like to have more children but can't. Now, yes, you do have a certain segment of the Japanese population who doesn't want to get married, or who they want to get married and have no kids. And I don't necessarily think that's a problem, but society needs to think about how to deal with that. How can we kind of square the fiscal responsibility for that? Because someday those people are going to grow old and require care, and the younger generation is going to have to pay for that. So how do we make sure that people who choose not to have children are also contributing to the future of society's development? And so I guess in response to how do I feel about China's specific case, I'd really just say that I think that the Chinese government needs to think of ways not to punish people for making an individual choice, because there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't want to have children. I don't want to shame anyone. That's not my goal. I don't have any children at this point, and I might like them eventually, but I understand why people don't want children. They're a lot of work, they're tough, they're hard, and I don't think that it's necessarily natural for people to always want lots of children. So I don't have a solution for China's problem, but it's something I'll definitely look into in the future. So thank you for that. And we have one question here at KO that I want to bring up.
Yes. Personally, I think Japan should consider to revive or revitalizing the role of their rural areas, because by redistributing the production into the rural area, more working people will choose to live in the rural area, because they will have more relaxed there when they are working. And also, even I think the migrant will also have option to work in Japan and enjoy working here while having also the proper condition for their working job. And of course, with the increasing incentive, for example, it also interact migrant to work in Japan. But the question is, what kind of incentive that Japan can give for migrant people to work in Japan, even if they live in rural area, so they don't tend to go to the big cities in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that you've touched on a really critical piece, which is that everybody thinks Tokyo is great, and I live in the Tokyo metropolitan area, so I understand. But the reality is that in some ways Tokyo is overrated. It's crowded. The public transportation is a nightmare every day, and a lot of companies here will work you to death. And so I think you make a very valid point that rural communities actually offer both Japanese and immigrants really an attractive way to live a different kind of life. But the main problem that I see being an obstacle to particularly immigrants living in rural communities in Japan is that many of these rural communities are not equipped to handle the specific needs of immigrants. They don't have schools that can teach migrant children. They don't have necessarily government offices that can offer counseling or support or or even really just services necessarily in the language, in that person's native language. And so I think that one of the biggest things the central government could do would be to increase funding for rural areas to develop their ability to support more diverse communities. Sorry, it's a bit of a short answer, but I hope that works for you. Yeah. So we're just about out of time. If anybody just has one thing they have to say, I'll take it, but I probably have to go. We good? If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And also, I guess we'll be seeing each other in Shanghai on Saturday. So you can approach me there, and I'd love to talk more about it. So if there's nothing else, yeah, I'd like to.
Question from Bhutan.
Okay, quickly. So yeah, really quick.
I was wondering if you could
Yeah.
elaborate more on the North Korea bit. Do you think it's more likely in the event of North Korean liberalization that
You guys can go
North Korean
first, but I
migrants
need to-
provide a better base than existing migrants
Mm-hmm.
around Japan right now?
Sorry,
Do
can
you
you
think
just
they're more
repeat,
likely to be,
yeah, repeat that last part?
do you think North migrants will be more likely to be accepted into Japan than existing migration solution?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, North Korea's external policy would have to change for this to be true. Like, North Korea can't be threatening the rest of the region and have this policy of migration that I talked about work. But I do think that Japan has a long history of accepting, of integrating migrants from the Korean Peninsula into Japanese society. And so I think that relative to migrants from almost anywhere else in the world, they would have a very large leg up and would integrate much more easily than migrants from elsewhere. So that's my very quick answer to your question. I hope that is what you wanted. Yeah?
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you all on Saturday. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, let's get together all together in Shanghai. To send
Okay, thank you so
Thank
much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
And
Thanks.
welcome all of you to Fudan campus this weekend.